Hello everyone. So I would like to start the presentation by saying Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. And then I would like to give a brief introduction to the Sikh genocide that lasted from the year 1984 to 1994. So firstly, I would like to honor the thousands of Sikhs, activists, farmers, students, and civilians who fought for the civil liberties but were subjected to disappearances and died at the hands of the India's state-sanctioned violence. So from 1984 to 1994, the Sikh minority in India was subjected to state massacres, mass torture, gang rape, and extrajudicial killings by India, which resulted in what could be termed as the Sikh Genocide. This was after a major civil disobedience movement in Punjab, a decade of the largest pro-federalism protests by the Sikh minority of India, and it was guided by the Anandpur Sahib resolution and spearheaded by Sant Jarnail Singh Ji Khalsa Pinjamwale from the holy city of Amritsar. Sikhs in India were subjected to high levels of racism, and in 1982, the Sikh government officials, members of parliament, and students were banned from the Asian Games being held in the national capital, Delhi. Army was deployed with sentry guns to keep the protesters in check, and thousands were arrested, beaten up, and publicly humiliated. The media portrayed Sikhs as terrorists rather than civil disobedience activists for showing their warrior saint martial heritage of 300 years. This warrior saint heritage, which was born of compassion, had fought for the freedom of religion for all in India for centuries. Sikhs were also prominent in fighting for the Allies in World War I and II, as well as for the independence of the Indian country. This martial heritage was projected through government propaganda as aggression and a threat to the majority Hindu population, even though Amritsar, the holy Sikh city, remained a hub for social activism, with poor Sikhs and Hindus coming for help. The Indian state-sanctioned violence reached its heights in June 1984, when Amritsar, the sacred hearts of the Sikhs, was attacked and Punjab was militarily occupied by India. Thousands of unarmed Sikhs were massacred. These are some views from the attack on Amritsar 1984. Months after the Amritsar massacre, in November 1984, thousands of Sikhs in Delhi were targeted, massacred, and gang raped by the Indian state-sanctioned mobs in just 3 days, while the police coordinated the attacks and the Indian military did nothing in the state capital. Not one single person of the Hindu majority population suffered harm. Ordinary civilians tried to help their neighbors or to aid them in internal refugee camps, but were paralyzed by the police, racist rumors against Sikhs, and just the sheer organization with which India carried out the killing. They identified Sikh houses through registers, government records. They marked Sikh houses, brought in weapons and killers to then burn Sikhs to death. Thousands of Sikh women were rounded up from the poorest neighborhoods, collected in vehicles, and taken to be gang raped, while over 4,000 Sikhs were burned to death. So these are some views from the Delhi massacre of 1984. Millions of Sikhs around the world protested the ongoing atrocities in India amidst calls to separate from India and build a new country. During the 10-year civil war that followed the events of 1984, Indian state-sanctioned torture of the Sikhs and mass enforced disappearances of the Sikhs became the norm. At many points, even Article 21 of the Indian Constitution, which is a right to live and to life, was suspended in Punjab, and laws with no accountability, such as the TADA, Terrorist and Disruptive Activities Prevention Act, were introduced. KPS Dillon, a former head of police in Punjab, said that TADA was used on Sikhs alone, with only 3% conviction rates on actual militants. TADA was used on political dissidents and unarmed civilians who were sympathetic to the Sikh struggle. Human rights activists tried to highlight that TADA was being used to crush the Sikh civilian population and dissidents. This resulted in harassment, stigmatization, and the vulnerability to be arrested and tortured if they were still alive and not killed in custody. The coercion and torture that survivor families received was horrendous, and our panel will share some examples. Turbaned religious Sikhs, mainly young men, were targeted, almost akin to a pattern of androcide. They were killing all the young men from age of 15 to 45. Kumar and many other human rights activists were able to prove that the police had a pattern of arresting Sikhs. They would take them to different police stations across the region, but never the local one, so that the families could not see them. By the time the people had tried to find a way through the maze of legal systems by selling land to pay lawyers, paying huge bribes to policemen, or through habeas corpus. The family members were almost always missing. The arrested people were tortured, raped, and it was hit and miss if they survived. Some survivors to this day still believe that their loved one is coming home. The murder of Punjab human rights community and its paralysis. We can only estimate the violations of torture and the dead, because during the Civil War, human rights activists were often targeted, randomly murdered, and disappeared by the state. In the last 30 years, impunity has stayed rife, with key heads of torture being promoted into senior roles. The paralysis of the human rights community has only been exacerbated. Facades of various human rights commissions constructed by the state were inept in the least. Now, I would like to share some examples of some human rights activists and other people who played a role in the Sikh struggle. Lawyers like Kulwant Singh, for instance, was killed by the police with his wife and child in 1993 on his way to see a client and her child who were jailed. 5,000 lawyers held a strike to protest it for 2 months and put a petition to the High Court, but the five-member panel of judges refused to put out even an inquiry for investigation into his murder. Jaswant Singh Khalada, a human rights defender in Punjab, was trying to investigate and document disappearances and paid the price for going against the police. He was abducted and tortured. His findings, later known as the Khalada findings, proved custodial murders and illegal mass cremations. Ram Singh Baling, a journalist, was murdered on June 3, 1992, as he tried to expose the extrajudicial killings in his article, Who Will Unveil the Truth of So-Called Police Encounters. He was also the secretary of Punjab Human Rights Organization. Doctors who tried to treat patients with bullet injuries were killed. Widows also struggled to be heard. Widows like Jagdish Kaur, 35 years later, after the massacre, are still trying to bring perpetrators to the court. Her husband and family members were burned to death by mobs in the Delhi massacre, while the police stood by. She has been personally intimidated by the police and politicians, who she can identify directly, but her plight is not alone. She was only asked in 2004 for her statement by the Indian courts, 20 years after the massacre and after numerous failed commissions. She says, I only received the summons in 2004. I do not know whether any action was taken by the Rangnath Mishra Commission on my affidavit. My memory is good. I had named all the persons who were responsible on November 1 and 2, 1984. Police officers who openly refused to torture or were internal sympathizers of the Sikh struggle risked elimination. Bagicha Singh, for instance, once in the border security force, upon seeing the torture of Sikhs, joined the separatist movement, and his family was tortured. Post the human rights struggle. In 1997, former Justice Kuldeep Singh headed the People's Commission of Punjab. In Chandigarh, they heard for 3 days from thousands of families affected by the extrajudicial killings and torture. Notices were served to the accused police officers, but no one turned up. The High Court banned the People's Commission in around 1977-1998. The judiciary has been complicit in ensuring that cases weren't heard for habeas corpus, while people were alive in custody and even in getting justice for survivor families to this day. The collusion between the judiciary, political parties, intelligence agencies, and the media meant negligible redress for the survivors, rendering the legal systems impotent. After a lot of years, the CCDP, Committee for Coordination on Disappearances in Punjab, was the one point where activists, religious groups, and social elites came together post-conflict. Fueled by their passion, these elites spent several years trying to locate the victims mentioned in the Khalada findings, while taking significant risks, including police threats. However, the CCDP noted on several occasions that the compensation without admission of liability of the Indian state in the Khalada findings is not acceptable, and eventually the CCDP could not continue the struggle for documentation and justice further with impunity. The rise of extremism in India against minorities, the Muslims across India and in Kashmir, as well as the Dalits, continues to this day. Activists from these vulnerable groups are also under the threat, and India is coming under red alerts of a flashpoint for genocide. We hope there are further panels to discuss the threat to minorities across India in the future, as the abuse of power by the Hindutva state and the rise in Hindutva fascism needs further analysis. The use of extremism via media, tech-savvy citizens, means that the rights of minorities in India are often being subverted, and the extent of the rise of fascism within India being underplayed. Punjab still remains a region of impunity with activists, dissidents, and separatists still facing problems. Now, I would also like to share a few more presentations of the period from 1984 to 1994. Even small children had to suffer from all those atrocities. And Team Taran had also gathered some intel on the people who had suffered at the hands of the government. Now, after me, Jagjit Singh from the Punjab Documentation and Advocacy Group would share his experiences and will continue further. Thank you.